There it was, one of the first sales of legal cannabis in this country, just after.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Agree or Disagree, the podcast. This is Kevin Olenick. You can add me as a friend on Facebook, Kevin Olenick. Like Agree or Disagree, the podcast on Facebook as well. Follow me on Twitter at KEVOLE. You can find all podcasts, Spreaker.com, KEVOLE. You can subscribe to Agree or Disagree, the podcast on iTunes, soon on Spotify. Follow on YouTube and Instagram as well. And, of course, I would like to take you back to Wednesday, October the 17th, just this week. It was the day that cannabis became legal in Canada. It was a celebration for many across this country that have been battling for, educating for, and yes, even being arrested for. People like Mark and Jody Emery, people like Dana Larson, many more that have been involved, including my guest today. Paul Doroshenko is a criminal lawyer, partner at Acumen Law Corp in Vancouver BC, interested in exploring ideas, defending pragmatic ideas, and sometimes a TV talking head. And he joins us today on Agree or Disagree, the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Kevin. How are you doing?
Great. So I'm currently in Kamloops, British Columbia, and I am looking out the window, and the world still seems the same that it did after Wednesday. Is it the same for you after Wednesday? Did anything blow up? Did the world end on Wednesday, or is everything still fine on your world there?
My recollection is that the only people who thought the sky would fall would be the police. They were the only ones who were out there saying that this was going to be the end of the world and that they needed all of this extra time from July 1st to October 17th to prepare. Things just continue on. People have been using cannabis in British Columbia for decades. This is just moving to the point now where people can lawfully use it.
There we go.
Not much more than that.
So why did this take so long?
It's ridiculous that it took so long. It's actually kind of embarrassing as a species and as a democracy, as a Canadian, to think that this took so long. The Senate had a recommendation almost 50 years ago to legalize cannabis. And here we are, decades later, before we finally get to it. I know 30 years ago, people who were using it for medical purposes, taking chemotherapy and using cannabis because it was the only way to get an appetite afterward. All of this time, with all of this opposition and all of these people who opposed it, and lots of people are pointing out the fact, the hypocrisy that many of the people who opposed legalization are now out to cash in. But all of these people who opposed it, and it was nonsensical. It was just nonsensical.
Yeah, and I heard Jody Emery even talk about sort of the. We'll get into some of the problems, but it is interesting that some of the people that are opposed to it were one of the first people to profit from this, try to profit from this.
Absolutely, there's former police chiefs, former politicians like Brian Mulroney. Who are out there, ready to sign up. And it's particularly offensive for somebody like Jody Emery, who's put it on the line to be an activist, and many other people. She's one of many across this country who put it all on the line. And, to have somebody else come along sort of at the end when the battle is won and say, okay, I was opposed to this all the way along, but now I'm going to make some money off of it. It's galling. It's upsetting, but I think you just have to come to terms with the fact that that's just the way it's going to be. Upsetting for me is looking back and thinking of the position that the federal government took. So many times, they would instruct their prosecutors to seek jail for these stupid offenses connected to cannabis. And, to have the government take that position, really taking that position right up until the end, it's just ridiculous, just absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, it's a good point. And for all that they said that they were legalizing cannabis, I think the way that it really feels to me that one of the steps that it's almost feels like to me like there's permission to do cannabis, but it doesn't feel like the government is willing to make this socially acceptable. Is that a fair comment?
Well, I think that they're a ways away from being comfortable with it themselves. I think the socially acceptable issue is probably not as... I think they accept that it's socially acceptable. I think the problem is that they're concerned about it going awry with some poor quality cannabis making people sick and then having it screw up their whole legalization, and then feeding the Andrew Scheers of the world who want to recriminalize cannabis by having somebody get sick as a result of some bad weed. So I think that's part of their concern. I've been looking back at this, and I've been advising some companies that have been setting up to grow over the last year, and one of the things that's been frustrating for us is, you couldn't get permission to grow 4 months ahead. So here we are, legalization date comes. The only real supplier we've got is Canopy. Canopy's not in the position to grow as much as they need. Canopy's ready to buy from anybody else who can grow probably right now, because they've got the complete distribution network set up. But the federal government didn't facilitate people to start beforehand so they'd be prepared on October 17th, which is ridiculous. At the same time, we've got all of these dispensaries that have existed for a long time that are basically now facing raids any minute. It hasn't been as well thought out as you would hope, bearing in mind the fact that they took this extra time, that it's taken years. In the States, excuse me, that's a colleague's dog here. In the States, in the places where it's been legalized, it's basically been legalized as a result of a referendum. It happens overnight, and the sky didn't fall there. And now they've moved into regimes where things are properly regulated. The whole thing has been a bit of a shit show.
Yeah. So if Justin Trudeau or one of the members of the federal government were here now, what would be some of the things that you would recommend that they do to move this forward?
Well, they didn't think about, or at least they didn't turn their minds to the management of moving from dispensaries to, a network of regulated cannabis. And that's unfortunate. I mean, if they turned their mind to it, they sure didn't think about how they should do it. And it's a management issue. And one of the things that I've come to see in the course of my life, particularly as a lawyer, is that government is never very good at managing anything. I run a business. I have a law office. I have lots of employees. There's a lot of capital invested. There's times that we have malinvestment. There's times that we make managerial mistakes here. We're not trying to run the government, but we do a fairly good job. But they have to run the government with all of the restraints that are on government, all of the obligations that are on government, and it is quite hard to manage. And it's that the Conservatives hold themselves out as being these great managers, and they seem to be much worse usually than the Liberals. One of the things that John Horgan faced when he was elected, he sat down with his cabinet and said, "Yeah, okay, we've been in effective opposition. We've got some good ideas, but do we have the skill here to manage it? And we better figure out how we're going to do that. Otherwise, we're not going to get very far with the electorate if we can't actually manage things." And that was one of the things that Glenn Clark had failed in, because his government really didn't manage anything. So here we are. We've got the Liberals trying to manage this situation, and they haven't really thought out how to deal with the dispensaries and the existing network of gray market. And it's only really gray because these people have city permits to be able to operate. The city's given them the authorization. Federally, they've been committing criminal offenses as they operated, and we've all recognized that there's a a need for it, particularly in the medical arena. But they never came up with a good way to allow people to apply for licensing to be able to be a retailer, while at the same time they were committing the offense of selling it unlawfully. And now we're in a situation where we've heard of raids in Newfoundland and I think Port Alberni of dispensaries within days of legalization, which is just stupid because right now the federal government cannot provide that. All the governments, not the federal government, the provincial governments with all of their different systems they've set up to distribute cannabis cannot fulfill that demand at all, even close. And these dispensaries can fulfill that demand. So, I think they've got to come up with as I was saying on Twitter earlier today, some sort of ad hoc system where they're going to, ultimately shut down these unlawful dispensaries, but they're going to have to do it over a period of time. And if they let them continue to operate for too long, they run into a situation where they're giving sort of de facto authorization. So they are going to have to shut them down. The issue is, how are they going to shut them down? Are they going to keep these people from being able to transition into being lawful dispensaries? And are they going to be able to still be able to provide the product in the interim? Because if they were to just go bust them all today, I'll tell you, we'd have a big problem. We'd be just facilitating underground back alley sales, really sort of pumping the black market and the criminal element in cannabis sales. And nobody wants that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost would take us back in a sense, not take us forward.
Yeah, and it'd be temporary, but it'd be a fucking temporary nightmare. Like it would be, we could have months and months before these growers are able to get up to speed and have these large grows going. And I'll tell you, I've been talking to a number of them, and it's that the quality demands that the federal government is placing on them are substantial. It's probably, thoughtful, because it's Health Canada is making sure that this product that goes out is safe. And it's going to be a big expense to do it lawfully and safely. But, we regulate alcohol that way. Mm-hmm. So regulate cannabis that way. It's going to happen. You don't have people just setting up without any regulation, setting up a distillery and selling their stuff without any testing or anything.
Yeah. So if people are wanting to now, because of course, obviously the people that have been in this, they're dealing with this, but the people now that are thinking, okay, I would like to see how this works if I could get into the cannabis selling business, legal selling business. If someone was to come to you and say, I want to do that, what is your recommendation? What is the first thing that you would tell them?
Make sure you've got at least $250,000 because you're going to have to find a location, lease the location, or have some sort of guarantee that you're going to be able to have that location, which means you're probably going to be paying rent, even if it's deferred rent down the road. Then you've got to go through the licensing process. You've got to make sure that location is going to be permissible. But then you've got to go through the whole licensing process, which is long and drawn out, and it's going to cost you a lot of money to get there. And then once you get there, you might be in a situation where you're competing by the time you get there with 100 others nearby. So it's you've got to really be prepared for the long run. These companies that are getting into the cultivation are big, and they're big for a reason. They've usually got quite a bit of financial backing, and we're not talking like gigantic corporate backing. We're talking individuals who have put up $1 million, that everything that they've got type of thing, hoping that this is going to be a payoff in the long run. But we're talking gigantic facilities to manufacture, and you are going to be up against those companies that have a lot of small investors that put a lot of money into them to be able to set up their network to distribute at the same time. And you're competing also with the provincial government, which is going to be opening up cannabis stores. I mean, it shocks me that they didn't have more opened, but again, this is one of those issues of how fast can a government move when they're trying to manage something. Governments aren't the greatest managers. So I would say, make sure that you're well heeled. and inform yourself as well as possible. Get a number of people on board who are capable of helping and are skilled and are going to work at a reduced rate. It takes time, it takes money, and I think down the road there's a real potential for payoff in cannabis, because it's something many people want. There will be significant demand. The demand will continue for the future. Like it's not going away. It's going to be the same as alcohol. There's demand for it. The demand will continue in the future. A lot of people have earned good money with alcohol. Humans are all looking for some way to escape our brains from time to time. So it's something that if you're in the position to do it, get out there and do it. If you're not in the position to do it, there's going to be lots of jobs. There's going to be lots of good employment. There's already companies that are out there. Go find those companies and get involved with them. Lots of times you can get in and you can end up a shareholder with some company that's going to be successful producing or selling cannabis, and this is a opportunity knocking.
Do you see this? So basically, if you would you say to someone, I mean, obviously now it's like you have $250,000. Do you see that like a year from now, when we talk in October of 2019, do you see that changing, or do you see that this kind of staying the same, or what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I mean, the whole situation is going to be in flux for years to come. There will be opportunities for years to come. The people who are fast and quick out on the internet and took advantage of the internet, the people who develop software, there's still people making tons of money on that. The internet's still new. It's still, cannabis is going to be a new thing that we're sort of figuring out how the market works and where demand is and what people are interested in and what's going to be sold. And we're going to get to a point like Oregon has got to, where they've got now more cannabis than they can sell. But that's going to happen too. But this is going to shake out for years to come, and there's opportunity for years to come for people if they are interested in making a career in cannabis. I was just on as I was waiting for this, I was flipping through the internet, and there was a website about careers in the future that are not going to be so lucrative, and one of them is law. Which always concerns me, but careers in cannabis are going to be lucrative for a while. There's going to be a lot of people who are going to have to come up to speed and will be able to earn a good living doing it.
Speaking of law, there's been a lot of, I'm going to use the word misconceptions for the sake of this conversation, a lot of debate about some of the things that have been going on. I'm going to start with what your opinion is on the discussion around what age, the age limit of when someone should be legally allowed to smoke cannabis. What are your thoughts on that? And should there be an age, or what are your thoughts?
I guess I'm pretty libertarian on that. I think when you're considered an adult and you can vote, then I think you should be entitled to use cannabis, and I think you should be entitled to drink. We've got 19 as the drinking age in BC. I think when you're an adult, you should be able to participate in the things that adults are entitled to participate in. If we're not going to have a defining line that's significant, then we should think about what categories we have defining lines in. We start off as children. We spend this couple of decades where we're sort of growing and learning, and then we're thrust into adulthood, and then for the rest of our lives we're just adults. I think the transition period, could have some more defining points, but I would like it if we were, if there was science behind it instead of just politics behind it. Maybe we should have a point where, okay, suddenly you're 20 years old and you can buy and use cannabis, or maybe when you're 16 years old, you can have a drink with your parents and, under parental supervision, use cannabis. I just don't think any of it's really based on science. It's all based on what the politicians think the public will accept and not vote them out for. I would like to see a more reasoned view of it. I think this is something that the provinces should be smart enough to get together and figure out so it's consistent from province to province. So right now, if you live in Ottawa, chances are you're going to go over to Hull to get drunk. And if you live in Hull, you're going to go to Ottawa to buy your weed. Which is quite ridiculous. It's just a bridge in between. It makes no sense to me.
Yeah. Is there science on that, or is there been any studies done in your mind about when, like,
there's lots of published stuff, but I don't really accept any of it because all of the science has been so politically motivated. All of the science, very little research has been done around cannabis because it's a controlled substance up until earlier this week. So all of these studies that I am always reviewing studies with respect to impairment, cannabis impairment, and surprisingly, one of the most politically motivated groups in the States, which is the National Highway Traffic Safety Association. Really, their science is highly in question all of the time. Most of the time, none of it's peer reviewed. But they came out and actually hired somebody to conduct a study, to address impairment issues, and they produced a fairly reasonable report in the end. But I'm just waiting for really good science. I'm waiting for the Journal of Marijuana and marijuana and marijuana studies to start to lead to lots of people studying this to make some more solid determinations. I used cannabis when I was 15 for a while, not long. I never felt that I was addicted. It was just one of those things that I used. I don't know that it caused me any damage. I can't say. Does it cause damage to growing brains? Well, there's also kids who have epilepsy who can be treated with it. So, for us to still operate where we're primarily guided by the fear of the demon cannabis, we're going to have to get over that. And then the science, I think, will follow after that. But it kind of surprises me that we've had medical cannabis for a long time, and that the science doesn't seem to be really even close to being resolved.
What about the cannabis and driving debate? Have there been studies that it has been worse than drinking and driving? What are your thoughts on that whole debate? And not only driving here in Kamloops, of course, in the summer and around our area here, you're dealing with boats as well. But
operating any motor vehicle while you're impaired by alcohol or a drug is obviously a criminal offense in Canada. And the issue is, are you impaired? How impaired are you? Can they detect it? Right? So there's these phases of an impaired driving investigation. Police are looking for some sort of driving behavior at the beginning. But the issue is, how can you detect it when it's cannabis, and is the person actually impaired? So a lot of times police officers will be conducting the investigation. You don't have the physical dexterity problems. You don't have slurred speech. You don't have nystagmus in the eyes, so the eyes aren't twitching if they're pushed out to the side. If the police officer's doing a test with a pen, follow the pen with your eyes. You don't have any of those things. Now, if you don't have any of those things, the question is the person impaired? If they seem to be functioning fine, then they're not impaired. Just because they used cannabis, they're not impaired. But there's also the other issues like delayed reaction, and delayed reaction. You need a standard for the person. You need a standard for the subject. So, are we going to make everybody do a test when they go to get their driver's license so we can see what their baseline is? And then if they're tired, are they going to be, charged with being impaired by cannabis if they don't match their baseline on some test that the police do? The delayed reaction time is a concern because most people who use cannabis, first of all, most people when they're high on cannabis won't drive. That's been studied to some extent, and it'll be studied more, I'm sure, in the years to come. But it's kind of a I wonder how that study could be conducted, but that's the conclusion of the study so far, and I'm going to assume that there's some merit in them. When they do drive, and it's usually in like an emergency, I must drive despite the fact that I used cannabis. Most people who use cannabis compensate for their impairment. So, you have a few drinks, you might think that I can drive faster than I normally can, and I can get up behind this guy, got plenty of time to stop, and it's sort of that bad decision making there. And then there's also delayed reaction time when you've been drinking. Well, there is delayed reaction time, and that's probably the number one thing with impairment by cannabis. And most cannabis users, when they are high, will compensate for it by leaving more distance between them and the next vehicle. They will weave strangely within the lane. This is one of the funny findings. They'll weave within the lane, but they'll stay within the lane. So clearly there can be impairment. The issue is, okay, so I've left some more space between myself and that vehicle that's up ahead because I recognize that my reaction time is delayed. What happens when a vehicle comes out from the side that you don't anticipate? What happens if something comes onto the road that you don't expect? That's where the impairment comes in. The difficulty that we're going to have, and the major concern that we're going to have, is trying to assess people to make that determination that they are impaired. And I think, I'll lay it all out here. If you really want to get into it, I could probably talk about this one for about 6 hours. But I don't think that this is something that we can effectively regulate or deal with criminal law, with criminal prosecutions. We've sort of come to the determination that it's not just with this, but with other aspects of criminal law, that proving it beyond a reasonable doubt is almost going to be impossible, proving that the person is impaired. And when you've got evidence that is not going to meet the reasonable doubt standard, it doesn't mean that you don't want to have some sort of manner of addressing it. So, if everybody who's smoking cannabis, we can never prove that they were impaired in their ability to operate a motor vehicle, we're just giving a green light to smoke cannabis and drive. So we have to come up with some other way of dealing with it that's not criminal. And the issue is, how do you deal with that when it's not criminal? Well, we give traffic tickets for things that are not criminal. Those traffic tickets have penal consequences and stay on your driving record. And a traffic ticket can have pretty significant consequences. And those things are resolved in traffic court. But then again, that's still a reasonable doubt standard. If you run a red light, a police officer's got to come and testify and explain, that you ran a red light. And there's good reasons for that. I've won enough red light tickets for reasons that were full on legitimate that, I'm glad that we have that reasonable doubt standard for it. But when it comes to cannabis, I think the only way we can really get around this weakness in the evidence is by making it an administrative procedure. And we have that sort of the idea has been laid out in the Motor Vehicle Act, and it's unfolding now. Now that cannabis has been legalized, and we're going to see these other changes to the criminal code coming out in the beginning of December. But the problem that we've got is that we're still planning on stigmatizing people rather than trying to address the threat by rehabilitating them. So the focus with our immediate roadside prohibition scheme in BC, we use crappy evidence. We use evidence from roadside breath testers. We give people 90-day driving prohibitions and about $4,500 worth of consequences if they blow a fail into a roadside breath tester. The problem with that, and the problem with punishing people in an administrative scheme, is that the government wants to try and get everything that they could get in a criminal scheme. You get this thing on your driving record. It's the same as getting a criminal record in many respects. You can't get a pardon for something on your driving record. It follows you for years to come. And that's, I think they have to come up with a balance where they recognize, okay, this is going to have to be administrative, but if we want this to be constitutionally valid, and if we want the population to support it, then we're going to have to make sure that we do not hold this against the person for years to come, because you've got a police officer with their subjective opinion is going to be the thing that leads to it. that leads to the punishment, and punishing people on that basis, and leaving them with the stigma and the significant cost and damage from that. Most people are not going to accept that. They're not going to, they're not going to think that it's appropriate.
Right. So there's a bunch of things I want to unpack there. First of all, so it sounds like if you're impaired on cannabis, you're actually more conservative on the road, as opposed to when you're impaired on alcohol, you're more aggressive on the road.
That seems to be the findings of pretty much every significant study, including the NHTSA study. The people are more conservative on the road. Yeah, they're very careful. Most people think that they're much more high than they are. That was another thing. People assessing their own sort of state. Everybody thinks I'm fucking wasted. And a lot of the time, the tests that they do of people would find that you might be slightly affected, and that's about it. And when you smoke cannabis, the impairment is gone basically from 45 minutes after peak, and peak impairment is like 10 to 15 minutes after smoking. So if you stop smoking and you wait an hour, chances are you're not going to have anything for symptoms. You might still have some impairment that's not, detectable with our methods that we've got. And I, wouldn't want to get in the car with you driving. But 2 hours later, probably just fine. Interesting thing is that your THC really spikes and gets very high. And that's not necessarily, connected to impairment. It just happens to correlate to some extent. And then your THC level can stay fairly high, and it can go down, and it can come back up even days later if you, for example, if you in between meals, because it'll start to come out of your fat cells. If you consume cannabis and some sort of consumable, your THC level will not go very high, and it may be level for a long period of time, and you could be quite significantly impacted in your ability to drive from a consumable. And I say that from my own experience recently trying it. There's no way I would have driven, but I may have had a fairly low THC level, but it stays low for a long time, never really spikes up, and maybe never gets to the point that's even the prohibited per se level.
And you mentioned the police in there, and we talked earlier about how they needed to be more prepared from July 1st to October 17th. The conversations you were having with the police, what are you hearing from them?
Okay, here's the absurdity of this whole thing. We were in Ottawa. Kyla, my law partner here, was presenting to the Senate or the House of Commons. I can't remember which one. She's presented to both, but the chiefs of police from Ontario and Toronto were there just before us. And we were talking to them in the hallway. And they, then presented, and obviously, you got the sense that they were still working on the sky is falling model, but they'd come to terms with the fact that this was going to happen. They couldn't stop it. Cannabis was going to be legalized. And so they were there, we've got to do this. We need the time. We need this extra time for this. This is the threats we've got. And this was sort of a regular thing that we heard across the country, that, there's no way we're going to be prepared. Then we hear that, of course, the Draeger drug test 5000 is approved, and we got it here remarkably quickly. Kyla and I managed to get our hands on one, which was a hilarious coup for us. And we revealed the problems with it, and a bunch of police forces decided not to buy it. And we talked to some of the senior officers, high-level officers in police forces in British Columbia, who have told us, we should have just waited for you to, but we're glad we waited for you to buy it first so we didn't waste our money on it. And then they come out and they say, oh yeah, we're not concerned. No, it's fine. We're just going to use standardized field sobriety tests. No big deal. So all of that complaining about we're not going to be ready has now been reduced to, in the week before, don't worry everybody, because we're just going to use this old tool that we've had for forever. So how ridiculous is that? It just undermines the credibility of the police. I guess most people are probably not paying as close attention to me as I am to them, and the utterances that I hear from the police. But for them to say for the longest time that the sky is falling, that they won't be ready, that they need all this money, that they've got to do all this stuff. And then in the days that it's, just before legalization, to have them come out and say, yeah, no, we've got, we're going to use this method. It's fine. It's no problem. It's, the method we've been using since 2008. Come on. Yeah. Where's the it's a huge disconnect between what you're saying now and what you were saying then. And I suppose in the end, they're just trying to ensure people now are confident in the capacity of the police to do it. But for them to have been whining the way they did, months and a year over the last couple of years, just makes me not capable of taking them seriously. And they lose credibility. I mean, in my eyes, they've lost credibility for that reason. It's just silly. But, here they are, and they're claiming now they're going to rely on standardized field sobriety tests, and standardized field sobriety tests are going to get them nowhere with cannabis impaired drivers. So they really don't have any tools, and it's, back to the credibility gap. I'm looking at it from my perspective. I've been trained in standardized field sobriety testing. And one of the first things they tell you is, none of this has ever been certified for use for detecting cannabis impairment. So you're like, oh, okay, well, it's great for alcohol. Does work to some extent. Doesn't work for cannabis.
It sounds a little bit like you talked about. This is that politics game, and it sounds from your perspective that it's the politics from the police, because a lot of police for years in Vancouver wouldn't touch anybody that was smoking anything. It's just be like, okay, we'll just go on with your day. But yet we're hearing in big picture, well, we needed this, we needed that, we needed the other thing. It feels political.
Well, it's money. It's budgets. They're always looking for more money for their budgets. We have a problem in this country, which is quite difficult for the police. And it gets back to this whole point of proving cases beyond a reasonable doubt. It's hugely expensive to conduct investigations. We have disclosure requirements that are massive, and there's good reason for them. Like, I get all sorts of, in a typical impaired driving case, my file, I'm looking at one sitting on my desk here, and it's 1.5 inches thick of papers that the police have had to provide. Now, if the police didn't have to provide that 1.5 inches thick stack of papers, my client might be convicted. It's because I got that 1.5 inches thick stack of papers, and I found some things in there where the police did something that they shouldn't have done that compromises the quality of the evidence that they've collected, that I'm going to succeed for my client. So the disclosure obligations we have under the Charter of Rights protect us from wrongful conviction, but they're so expensive and difficult for the police to comply with. You can imagine like a typical impaired driving investigation. The police officer is there for 4 hours dealing with the individual, and then they've got maybe another 4 hours of paperwork, and then they have to submit it. And if there's a trial, then there's another day in court and some preparation, and some days these days with the number of charter arguments we come up with, 4 days in court, and all to get to the point where we succeed because we find something that's undermines their credibility or what have you in the investigation. So the police have these really, really difficult budgets to prosecute people for things like impaired driving. In BC, they do it now with immediate roadside prohibitions. It saves them a ton of money. People's rights are, in my view, grossly compromised. I don't think they found the right balance. But the police are, perpetually fighting a budget shortfall. And it costs a lot of money. What's the most expensive thing in any company? That is the cost of staff, employee salaries. And, they have to pay tons of people to make tons of photocopiers and photocopies and to prepare all of this stuff. Each police officer spending dozens of hours on any investigation costs money. Yeah. They need more. They want more. Anytime they're in front of, Parliament or something, it's like, give us more money. You want us to do more, give us more money. We don't even have enough money to do the things that we need to do right now.
Yeah. it's leading me, what you're saying there is leading me to the next step, because I mean, yes, this is about money and this is, but if someone came up to us and said, I'm an alcoholic, there's a sense of a little bit of compassion towards them in that, okay, you need help, all that. But if someone said, I'm a cannabis user, not an addict, I use marijuana, I use cannabis for whatever reason, there seems to be a bit of a different stigma to that. Why is that?
I think that's one you'd be unpacking for days, or weeks, because that's full on historical context of that. We've had the puritanical attack on alcohol, and we blame. We're all a product of all sorts of different things, genetics and learned behavior, and so much of it is defined by the time we're 5 years old. Why do you end up becoming an alcoholic down the road? Why are some people more prone to addiction than others? I've seemed to observe that. It's sort of perpetually suggesting that you're immoral if you're addicted to anything. We are going to get to the point, right now you say, okay, you're an alcoholic if you have if you have a drink every day, if you have 2 drinks every day, if you have 3 drinks every day, if you have 4 drinks a week, maybe you're an alcoholic. If you deny that you're an alcoholic, that means that you're an alcoholic, because you haven't come to terms with your alcoholism. So it's mostly got to do with, I guess, religiously motivated moralism. Alcohol has been prohibited. Alcohol is discussed in the Bible and interpreted as it would be. I don't think cannabis is in there. If it was, it's never been discussed, publicly that I'm aware of. Different shifting moral standards for the two different things. I think the addiction is different. I don't see people who have a cannabis addiction, causing the destruction that we see with people who have alcohol addictions. And, I don't think you can destroy your body quite the same way. You might be able to damage your brain, I suppose, if you use enough, but, the long-term implications of drinking a lot all the time are pretty well known and pretty devastating.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting. It's interesting that we know the long-term impacts on alcohol, and yet there's more of an acceptance to, I don't want to say maybe that's the wrong word. It's more of a understanding for an alcoholic, but yet for cannabis, it's treated more as the villain. And I guess that goes back even to the war on drugs in the 80s, which, I mean, if Ronald Reagan was alive, I bet you he would apologize for that, because I don't think that helped a lot, or at all.
Well, so we look at alcohol, and we get people who are charged with impaired driving, for example, and they come to court, and some of them are alcoholics and some of them are not. And for some reason, and I'm not knocking the court, I'm just saying this is a reflection of our society. The people who are not, there doesn't seem to be much sympathy with. The people who went out one night and got themselves to the point where they were at 140 milligrams and 100 milliliters of alcohol, and they don't do it very often, and then they drove and pulled up to a roadblock. Not much sympathy for those people. The people who pull up to the roadblock and then go into AA, and they've maybe done this every day for 10 years and just finally got caught. We look at it and we say, okay, alcoholism is a disease. Okay, yeah, fair enough. And this person has been suffering as a result of alcoholism, and we look at them differently. And that to me has been a frustrating hypocrisy in my job. we'll see how people view cannabis. There was something on CBC earlier this week, and they started talking about how cannabis is going to affect our culture. And I've been talking about this for a few months, and everybody always wants to talk to me about the law. And I keep thinking, like, we're going to see, all sorts of writing. Mm-hmm. We're going to see novels that engage and discuss cannabis. We're going to have music. There's all sorts of music about drinking. There's drinking songs that goes back as long as there ever was. There's also cannabis songs, as many. Now that it's going to be something lawful, we're going to see more cannabis in art. We're going to see cannabis in all sorts of different ways becoming part of our culture. And ultimately, the way that we, sort of morally view it and morally view addiction is going to be impacted and feedback from our cultural view of it as it develops over the next decades. So we'll see how we see it in 20 years' time. Mm. And I'd like to, see a more sophisticated understanding of alcoholism rather than just it being sort of either personal weakness or you are a threat or, what have you. It's none of it's consistent. Mm.
No, there's a lot of, there's a lot on that. Which the next part of this has to do with, and Jagmeet Singh has been the most vocal about this, expunging those that have a marijuana charge on their criminal record. Where are we on that? Where do we need to go on that? How have you felt that has been handled?
I think it should have been discussed long ago. I think the federal government just saying that they're not going to deal with this until after legalization was dumb. I've been not impressed at all with the way that the changes to the criminal code, basically most of the stuff that our justice ministry in Ottawa has handled has been sort of counter to the expressed viewpoints of our prime minister. But as far as records and expunging records for people are concerned, I'm very worried about the proposal that Ralph Goodale came out with, and I accept his genuine desire to ensure that people are not punished, particularly not suffering the ongoing stigma of a criminal record, particularly in circumstances where it's simple possession. But I think they've got a big problem in the way that they've laid it out. So they are saying they're just going to rely on the pardon system and that they're going to waive the fees and that they're just going to allow people to apply for pardons the normal way, and they're going to speed it up. Well, think about this, okay? If you've got a criminal conviction for smoking a joint in the parking lot of the Port Alberni Hotel in 1983, there's no electronic record of that probably. And in order to apply for your pardon, you're going to have to go down. They're going to quite literally find those files in a dusty government warehouse somewhere. It's going to get pulled out. It's going to cost money. It's a pain in the ass. Go to the court registry. You go through all of this, and you do your local police criminal record check, and then you send in your application. Now you create an electronic record that the Americans might be able to get access to, and an electronic record that did not exist before. And the Americans don't recognize pardons. And the Americans don't let people in when they've got criminal convictions for most drug offenses. So, I mean, if you've got a criminal conviction for a handgun offense, they're probably going to let you in. But if you've got a criminal conviction for a drug offense, you can expect to be turned around at the border.
That's a whole other podcast in and of itself, by the way.
Yeah. So, I'm really concerned about their plan. You mentioned expungement. I think you press the delete button. I think you do search for everybody who's got a simple possession conviction and delete it. Now, what are you going to do about the person who's got a simple possession conviction, and then they've got 4 more convictions for other things after that. You know, are you going to pardon the other convictions? Are you just going to deal with the simple possession conviction? The simple possession conviction should not be on there. How are you going to deal with those circumstances? So then you've got the person, unfortunately, who's got, 1 possession for the purposes of trafficking because they had, more than 30 grams in 1996 when they were out to buy some cannabis for their spouse who had cancer and was going through cancer treatment, and they ended up with a conviction. Are you going to seriously leave that conviction on somebody's record? So I'm not happy with it at all. I think they should be going back, and I think it's just a matter of pressing the delete button on the simple possession ones. And I think they need to have a different procedure rather than the pardon system to address these other ones. There's lots of people out there, young men who end up with a conviction for cultivation because they were hired to trim or sit on plants. And here we are, a decade afterward, and it's held those people back. And the stigma of that conviction has basically kept them from being successful in their life. I've had so many clients who I've managed to get an acquittal for or keep them free from a criminal conviction, and they've gone on and been wildly successful in something else that has led to great value for our society. Every once in a while I get up like a phone call or an email from somebody I defended 15 years ago, and now they're, the head of this, and there's some company with 150 employees. And you've got all of these people who have these criminal convictions for cannabis related offenses that, it's basically, it's caused economic damage for them to have those convictions on their record. And it's something we recognize now. You could say it was obviously motivated by money, but it's also motivated by money for something that the population generally accepted. And we've now, concluded that it's legal, not to trade it that way, but the government had never come up with any scheme to allow it to be legal before. I really think it's something that's has to be revisited because it's much too nuanced than just, pushing people through the pardon program. There's not that many people who have convictions for simple possession. Like if you were charged in Vancouver in the last 15 years, chances are you got a conditional discharge. If you were convicted. The only time we see it is there's been people who had slightly more than 30 grams and who pled down to simple possession. But then you're saying, oh, okay, that guy who had 60 grams who pled down and got simple possession, he's going to get a pardon. But the guy who had 260 grams, he's still stuck with his trafficking charge on his record.
What about those that were charged for selling? What about that? I haven't heard a lot about that. Is this an issue that we need to be concerned about, or?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is again like there's basically trafficking and cultivation were the two things that people were charged with, and if you had 30 plants or 10 plants in the basement, you'd end up with a conviction for cultivation if the police executed a warrant and you ended up going to court, and fairly good chance you'd face a conviction. Growing them out in the garage. Do we think that it was something that we really should be giving people criminal records for now, as we're looking back and reflecting on the behavior of the attitude of our society before? Under Harper, they had introduced a legislation with more than 4 plants, you were going to jail for a year. The trafficking to a minor, which was basically, we have the monster truck event in BC Place, and there's 18-year-olds and 17-year-olds sitting together, and they pass a joint from one to the other, and all of those kids who were 18 could go to jail for a year under the Harper regime. Looking back, that's the absurdity of that is monumental. Should we be revisiting all of those convictions from that era and further going further back than that with a genuine, rather than just the federal government coming out and saying we're giving pardons to people, a genuine sort of revisiting of it, a real reflection, maybe some sort of inquiry, but or study or something that we can look at to see what the implications are and come up with some good policy rather than sort of we didn't do this up until now. We're going to do this now, October 17th. We're going to tell people we're going to do this. It just doesn't feel like it's thought out at all.
And if I was one that had one of those charges and I'm applying for a job, if I had a job or a charge of possession and I was applying for a job, obviously you can't lie on your application. Or you shouldn't be lying on your application. Maybe that's a better way to word that. But is that something that needs to be discussed as well? Should I not be allowed to have a job because I have a past possession from 1996?
Well, and that's the point. I mean, there's lots of people who have been disqualified from lots of jobs over the years as a result of that. As a result of that conviction. And if you're applying to TELUS, they're going to ask you to sign a document that lets them do a criminal record check on you. And they've got two applicants there for the IT position. One of them's got a conviction for cultivation from 2002, and one of them doesn't. And you're trying to figure out who to hire. It's kind of simple. The guy who's got the conviction is not getting the job.
Two more quick things here. I want to talk about, there have been some people that have taken their cannabis across the border or tried to, in some cases. The government there in the U.S. has said not to do it. Are you still hearing people doing that? Or are we seeing more of an education of just, if you're going to do this, be careful? What are your thoughts around? You kind of touched on that a little bit, but
if I was the government, federally or provincially, if I was the provincial government in BC right now, I'd be putting up large signs along the highway, warning people not to attempt to cross a border with cannabis. And if I was the federal government, I'd be putting them right at the border. And I think our governments have a duty to do this because we've made it legal. It's not legal to cross the border with it. All the border crossings, every one of them is a federal government agency in the U.S. And the federal government in the U.S. still says that cannabis is full-on criminal. And we've got, Jeff Sessions and Donald Trump in power, and cannabis is not going to be made legal under that regime. And you're facing a possibility of going to jail. Maybe a likelihood of going to jail. I don't know. I'm not an American lawyer.
Right.
What I would tell you is that you show up at that border, you've got cannabis in your possession, in your vehicle, or in your possession. You can expect to be going away in handcuffs to a U.S. jail, and this is a significant problem. And I think we are going to see. I mean, it's going to end up being these sort of CTV news story on the dramatic, horrible circumstance that happened to the 19-year-old, girl who crossed at a Soyuz or something like that, who's sitting in a jail cell in the States. That's going to be the result if we are not notifying people at the airport, at any border crossing, in big, bold letters. And that should have all gone up on October 16th at 10 o'clock p.m. To notify everybody. And if it hasn't happened up until now, our governments are letting us down because not everybody knows or is turning their mind to it.
Yeah, because it's legal in Washington, correct? In the state of Washington.
It's legal in Washington, yeah, but it's not legal at the border.
Yeah.
The border is a federally run organization. All border crossings are federal officers and applying federal law. You show up at the border there. I'm not joking. This is not a metaphor. Expect to go out of there the other direction in handcuffs. you'll get to cross the border into the United States. Just you'll be sitting in an American jail.
Yeah, you're not staying at that hostel you were planning at.
No, and they're not just turning you away. Oh, we found a little weed in your car. Ha ha ha! Turning you away. No, your car's probably gone, and you're going to jail.
Yeah.
So don't show up there with anything that you can't cross the border with. And we get being so close to the border in the Lower Mainland, a lot of people are just accustomed to popping across the border for something. Or they've got friends or family and sometimes vacation homes in the States because the real estate's half the price of 5 kilometers on the other side of the border. And there will be people who are not cautious about it. There will be people who think, I want to take a little bit of dope down to Washington and I'll use it there. That is I don't know what they're going to do to you at the federal border coming into Canada from Washington State, but you hit a U.S. border crossing, you're in a world of trouble.
Mm. Mm. So all of this is going on. Still the sun is still rising here in Kamloops. It's still live. It sounds like things are alive in Vancouver. But there is going to be an opposition, where there will continue to be opposition. Andrew Scheer, as you mentioned earlier in this podcast, says if they win government, they are going to look at decriminalize or make it illegal again. So what education at this point, if there are a couple of things that still need to be done here, what are your recommendations now?
Well, I think Andrew Scheer has about a 0% chance of the Conservatives forming government now. Justin Trudeau is in a pretty safe position. We're going to have 5 more years or something like that of Liberal government. Cannabis is going to be just a regular thing. It's not going to be counterculture anymore. It's going to take away some of the neat aspects of it, I suppose. And some of the people who have been heroes under cannabis are going to have to, as cannabis counterculture people, are going to end up having to morph into something else. We're going to educate ourselves about these things as things play out, and it's just going to become part of our society and part of our culture. As far as what we need to learn, I'm not in any panic about any of it. Mm-hmm. I think, we've got some immediate issues, pressing issues that we got to deal with in the next few months. And most of that is supply and demand, and making sure that we are fair and reasonable to those people who have been running dispensaries, and, to try and let them sort of move ahead. We're going to have to educate our children. I think we do a pretty lousy job in educating children generally about alcohol and responsible alcohol use. All we ever talk about is driving. Right. There's a bigger problem in England with binge drinking, and it's they seem to really have failed their children there in that respect. I would like to see, and I think we're going to have to at one point or another make sure that we've got better education with respect to safe use of alcohol and safe use of cannabis. But ultimately, it's just going to become one of those things that we're used to. And right now, it's an interesting opportunity for a lot of people. And I'm looking forward to seeing what comes with respect to other medical uses. This is a plant that has some pretty fantastic things that can come from it, and it's a much more interesting plant than most. You talk to people who are experts in analyzing the chemical composition of it. There's a lot in there, and it's going to be interesting to see what other uses we have for it, medicinally and otherwise, and food.
Yes, that too. That's another. We could do another 2 hours on that for sure. Where that's going to go. Is there anything else we do need to what you want to touch on today, or?
No, I mean I just would like to, I hope that some people in positions of authority listen to your podcast, because the one thing that I failed to talk about often enough is this problem that we have with giving people significant stigmatizing punishment for driving offenses when the evidence is that bad. when the evidence is, and I don't mean bad, I just mean weak. And that's something that I have failed to flesh out. We talk about it here in my office often, but we're not really, involved that much in policy. Sometimes we're criticizing the government on certain things. Down the road, the government's going to just have to come to terms with the fact that there are things that you can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And if you're going to try and give people the same punishment that you would give them when you're applying a reasonable doubt standard, it's not going to fly. There's been they had a lot of blowback with the immediate roadside prohibition scheme, and they've continued to do this. And each time we get these decisions from the superintendent of motor vehicles that are completely illogical, we try and appeal them to BC Supreme Court. The court's going to start to figure it out at some point and see what's going on. And the same thing's going to happen with cannabis if they are trying to give punishment that is too extreme when you weigh it against the quality of the evidence.
Yeah, I think it's going to need to be that for sure will have to be an ongoing conversation for sure.
I worry about the people I see who are going to end up being victims of it as we sort this out going ahead.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much for Paul for going on. You can follow Paul at Paul PAULDOROSHENKO. Follow him. He's based out of Vancouver. Anywhere else we can follow you as well, or?
I'm on Twitter. There's Vancouver Crim Lawyer, I think it was. Vancouver Criminal Law on Twitter. There's Paul Doroshenko at Twitter. And I'm sort of the sometimes regular co-host on Kyla Lee's podcast, Driving Law with Kyla Lee.
Oh, cool.
So that's the other spot where I get to pontificate a little bit.
Oh, good. Well, we'll have you on again here. Follow me on Twitter, KVOLE. Facebook, Kevin Olenick. Like, agree, or disagree the podcast on Facebook as well. Spreaker.com, KVOLE is where all the podcasts are. iTunes, agree or disagree the podcast. YouTube, etc. Paul, thank you so much. I think this was a really important conversation to have.
It's my pleasure, Kevin. Thanks a lot. I enjoyed talking about these topics.
Yeah, great. And we will talk to you all very soon. Bye for now.